Hi everyone, I'm Nira Jory and I am so excited to be back with you at WCF. I had the unique privilege to lead CocoaAction for about 5 years. I'm very excited to hear the findings from the assessment and also to reconnect with many of the people that were instrumental in making CocoaAction happen over the years. As many of you know, the World Cocoa Foundation launched CocoaAction in 2014 as a voluntary industry-wide strategy that aligns 9 of the world's leading cocoa and chocolate companies: Barry Callebaut Group, Blommer Chocolate Company, Cargill Cocoa and Chocolate, the Ferrero Group, the Hershey Company, Mars Incorporated, Mondelez International Incorporated, Nestle, and Olam International, and along with the key stakeholders on regional priorities in cocoa sustainability in West Africa. When CocoaAction first launched, the companies recognized that the sustainability challenges of the cocoa sector required swift action and a radically different approach. And thus the CocoaAction strategy was created to align complementary roles and responsibilities, to leverage scale and efficiency through collaboration, and to catalyze efforts to accelerate sustainability. As the CocoaAction strategy reaches its conclusion in 2020, WCF and the CocoaAction members hired an independent third party, KPMG, to conduct an assessment of the strategy to help us better understand the performance of CocoaAction and to identify the lessons that can be taken forward in future initiatives. Today, we have Brigitte and Yerwin from KPMG Sustainability, who will be sharing a summary of their assessment of CocoaAction, including its successes, its challenges, and the lessons that they have found. And with that, I'll hand it over to Brigitte and Yerwin.
Thank you very much, Nira, and we're more than happy to share our learnings with you today. And before we do that, I think it's a really unique initiative that I remember vividly from the partnership meetings in, for instance, 2016, where it was really discussed as a unique initiative in the sector. And we'll take you through the lessons that we have learned. So if you would help me to look at the next slides, that would be much appreciated. Because the objective of the study was twofold. On the one hand, to identify and understand whether the delivery of CocoaAction was done in the most relevant, effective, efficient, and sustainable way. But more importantly, and that also reflects the approach we've seen from all participants, you all wanted to learn how to identify, summarize from this success, and also the failures that are associated with the delivery of CocoaAction. So it's really a learning assessment to make sure that everything that happened has a role going forward. And what was special about CocoaAction was really 5 things that the sector wanted to do different in this specific case. First of all, you wanted to align the sector on regional priority issues, really enable scale through common interventions and results framework, and apply a holistic focus on the farmer and his and her community. Share best practices and failures through a collective learning culture, and work closely with governments and key stakeholders. And let us now tell you through what are the, let's say, the main takeaways. And of course, let's start with things that went really well. Please help me with the next slide. Because the most notable achievements, and these were points that were taken noticed by almost everyone that we have interviewed, as we've used 35 interviews to collect the findings. We have the results of over 50 surveys where people really filled in detailed responses on how they experienced CocoaAction. And of course, we've looked at all the underlying documentation that was available from the project. First of all, CocoaAction brought the industry together and created what we call a pre-competitive workspace to discuss key issues. And that may sound something very obviously now, but in the beginning, this was really a new approach, really sharing from each other, like, what are you doing to tackle the major issues in the cocoa sector at farmer level? and in communities, and what are we doing? Something that was not so easily discussed by participants before, not in a peer-to-peer relationship within the major confectionery industries, but also not in a, let's say, client-supplier relationship, let alone with multiple suppliers in one place. So let's not underestimate that breakthrough. Secondly, the technical working committee really succeeded to be a vehicle for shared learning. And we could notice that on a daily basis also now when we interviewed some of the working committee members. At the very moment they were just chatting and interacting with other committee members, because they became a group of people that are used to work together and learn. Over time, also trust was built between the competitors, which is really unique and being leveraged in initiatives that also are recently started. Companies, moreover, recognize the value of monitoring and evaluation. And this is a very, let's say, complex challenge, but it is now in the industry much more used and appreciated than maybe before. And of course, what was really successful is the high-level commitment within the member companies to not only unlock resources for the CocoaAction initiative, but also gradually build stronger teams in their own organization to address deep-rooted industry issues in cocoa. But then, of course, as in all initiatives and multi-sector, multi-stakeholder initiatives, there are learnings and challenges ahead, and we'll talk you through that. Please proceed. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes, thanks. No, sorry, one back. Key lessons learned. We've summarized 5 lessons learned, and after this summary, I will guide you through the individual lessons learned. First of all, CocoaAction really seized momentum at the very moment of the start and getting kicked off. But in the end, it turned out it was not designed for systemic change, and we'll take you through that later. Secondly, CocoaAction really succeeded as a platform for industry collaboration for the companies that were involved, but less for a platform for all stakeholders to be engaged and really involved from the beginning and throughout. Thirdly, the governance structure was well defined, but not really geared towards delivering impact. The monitoring and evaluation system had good intentions, but lacked alignment on expectations and in the end, unfit for purpose. CocoaAction boosted sector capacity on sustainability and allowed them to learn from their efforts. Please proceed with the next slide. On seizing momentum, the overall strategy and objectives of CocoaAction were really designed in a bubble with minimal input from external stakeholders. That was felt within the group of companies in the World Cocoa Foundation, a relatively small group, but it was certainly not from the beginning with all NGOs or a government involvement from the beginning. And that was felt throughout the project. Secondly, the packages were really on the one hand on productivity, on the other hand on communities, but looking back, they were not fully holistic, so they were not taking the full enabling environment into account or other driving forces that may be beyond the control of individual companies, and therefore not really coherent with the realities on the ground. On the other hand, CocoaAction, it was designed as a strategy for impact. So really thinking through what needs to be done to be impactful, but it was also given a numerical target, and there was some friction between the two in the course, as it there was a target, but maybe not a full implementation program behind it. CocoaAction was also built trust with the members, but not to a point that they were individually held accountable very strongly for their commitments. And that was felt throughout the program as well. Next slide, please. The way forward, the design phase should really include other stakeholder groups from the beginning to have a public, private, and also social organizations partnership to make it long lasting. Packages to be addressed should be fully developed in a, let's say, future looking approach, really combining all elements to make economic or social development possible. And therefore you have to look sometimes outside of your sector or include interventions that have never been considered before. Building trust always remains very important, and the lesson learned is companies need to be individually held accountable so that everybody knows who puts which skin in the game and what is the progress related to that. Next slide, please. What we see is that, and I said before, the companies really collaborated. And it's also possible that holistic thinking really started in this initiative, but needs to be even stronger applied to really get to systemic change. And sadly, to conclude, the country origins were not really involved on a government level structurally, and therefore the local ownership was less strong than is required for such a fundamental approach. Next slide. How to take that forward? The ability to adapt should really be incorporated by design. So sometimes you need to be small, grow and adapt rather than start really big and have to reduce on the way. And it also should be really a focus on what is needed to solve the problem, and not only what can we do with this group of companies, but really root cause analysis, like what are the structural enablers to address. And that, of course, means that this cannot be done without the governments. And that is really a lessons learned that's felt throughout all participants. Next slide. With regard to the governance, so how the CocoaAction initiative was organized, we learned that it was not so easy to adapt very quickly to lessons learned along the way. And that's what we called not set up for agility. If you see as a team that the approach is not yielding the results you want, or you have roadblocks that you cannot move, or the way you communicate between a technical committee and a board is not really working, then you should be able to quickly adjust and really swiftly adjust the approach, especially because there's so many parties involved. And if that takes too long, then you stick too long to the same plan while you know that things could have been done a bit different. And of course, in the beginning it was strong because there was real leadership and real technical involvement, but the interaction between the two and really leading both groups to work together, that could have been done stronger. And that in the end resulted that sometimes the company participation faded a bit over time in terms of really participating to the full capacity on the actions required. Next slide. What do we take forward from that? First of all, agility needs to be built in by design so that this can be taken on board in every initiative. Of course, it's important to include also that interim results and roadmaps really are doing their work. And if something needs to be changed, it does need to be changed. And that is also a job in itself, to really maneuver a group of companies and their partners together. Next slide. With regards to the monitoring and evaluation system, most participants felt it was too complicated and too time-consuming to be successful. And that also had to do with the very prescriptive way of what a farmer with improved productivity should do. So if you are very prescriptive in how success looks like, also the monitoring and evaluation has to follow that. And that's quite tough in the reality of the CocoaOrigins. And there were also challenges with understanding exactly the M&A guide, but that of course is something we can learn from. And another thing, and that has really to do with how to bring data to insights and learnings, is that often the quantitative data need to be accompanied by qualitative data to really understand what are the numbers that I see, what are the root causes, if I not only look at the numbers, but also really contextualize with trainers in the field, with farmers, and really understand what is the data that I see and how are things not implemented, for instance, to the very prescriptive list that is used. Maybe there was a good reason to not implement all things prescribed, simply because that local situation only required a few of them. And the more qualitative information you have, the better you can read the data, and also the better you can adjust or steer your program. Next slide, please. So in the way forward, it's really an M&A system that needs to be understood and agreed by all, with very good reviews. And of course, if you need to measure impact, it should be clear what should be measured and why. And of course, a baseline assessment really helps to understand the changes over time. And it might be an idea to have a, let's say, cross-company impact reporting and more single also interpretation of the M&E approach, where now there was quite a few different interpretations from a M&A system that was thought to be very applicable for everyone, but then also the training or the guiding therein takes a lot of time. So better to centralize that a bit. Next slide. What we really heard from everyone is that the CocoaAction in itself was a movement that brought forward a very strong need to work on things together by connections, but by trust, and therefore also helping companies to boost their individual capacity on sustainability. And we've heard examples of really scaling up, for instance, the farmer productivity experience and capabilities in a company, where others said on the community side we needed to step in. And there were companies that said, okay, we've learned that we can really on the plant science side need more expertise in-house, as we clearly see that also others work on that, and you need that expertise. So we've seen different ways on how to build the capacity, but yeah, almost all companies said, okay, we've been increasing our capacity. Another lesson was that if you not engage with other commodity sectors, you may miss out on lessons learned in other sectors, but also bringing lessons of CocoaAction to other sections has been done to a limited account, and that was anticipated a bit more. Please proceed. What to take on board going forward? Trust, always a precondition. Capacity is really important in all companies, and of course, really learning should be taken into account. And the cocoa sector can be too inward-looking, perhaps, and learn from other agricultural systems and engage with that from learning, and also bring lessons to other systems, especially as we learned over time that multi-crop systems or more landscape approaches can be very successful. Next slide. This is where I think we have the opportunity to go to the questions. Nira?
Sorry, Erwin, I think we're waiting for if there are any questions from the audience on
yeah.
First.
Yeah.
Just waiting to see. Okay, it looks like maybe no questions yet. So I think maybe we'll go into our questions with the TWC members, and then we can see if there are any questions for the group at the end. So TWC members, can you turn your video back on so we can see all of your beautiful faces for this discussion? It's very exciting to be back with you guys today, as I said. And we're going to just walk through some reflections of the past 7 years, believe it or not. Nico, and we're going to kick off with you, and maybe just give a brief introduction to who you are for any audience members that don't know you. Nico, could you tell us a little bit about where the sector was back in 2013, 2014, and what CocoaAction was really trying to solve for back then?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Nico Debenham. I'm head of sustainability at Barry Callebaut. Been around in cocoa for quite a long time, 34 years to be exact. So seen quite a lot going on. I think what one has to remember is that the real kickoff of CocoaAction was what you might call what we used to call in the old days the Super 7, but it was actually the Leaders Council, which happened in around about 2012. And if you put that into context, that was pretty much a year to the day after the end of the Second Civil War in Ivory Coast. So it was a very volatile environment, which I think, because of the incredible strides that Ivory Coast has taken, it's difficult to really put that into context. You know, that's a very short time away. Most companies were committed to certification. We were kind of overemphasizing certification and productivity. There was still a lot of the old-fashioned CSR around, which, you know, build a school, build a water well, stick a logo on it, put it on your website, you know, aren't we clever? That kind of thing was still going on. Reporting of actions, not adoption or impact. By that, I mean, we would tell the world how many people we trained rather than what happened to those people that were trained and what the outcome for them was. And we had a very fragmented approach, very little cooperation between companies, and certainly no cooperation between industry and government. There was a big prediction out there that by 2020, 1 million tons, there'll be a 1 million ton global deficit. Well, that didn't happen. but deforestation did. So there is no global deficit, as we all see. And then, you know, at the time, there started to be calls for a much more holistic approach, increased diversity and stability of incomes at farm level, increased pre-competitive collaboration, creation of a level playing field, the need to you know, start tackling the social issues much more seriously. And deforestation was, you know, not even on the radar at the time. And then it all started to change from Choco Vision 2012, Senior Leaders Council, TWC, and then CocoaAction. So here we are.
Great, thank you so much, Nico, for taking us back. Our next question is for Taco. I don't know if Taco's been having some technical difficulties. Taco, are you with us? Okay, so maybe I'll pose the question, and any TWC member who wants to join in, please do share. This question is around CocoaAction introduced the concept of pre-competitive collective action. And we'd love to hear how easy or hard it was for companies to build trust and to work together. Nico, you're smiling. Maybe you have something to add there.
Okay. I mean, I do remember very, very much in the beginning, we sort of sat around the table looking at each other thinking, you know, am I going to put all my cards on the table, or am I going to keep some on my inside pocket? And, you know, I'm going to still kind of keep an eye on my peers or my competitors. And, you know, perhaps we came to a point where we were considering whether we would be trying to keep an eye on whether our competitors were performing to the way they claimed that they were performing. And, you know, I think the trust at the beginning was a struggle, to be honest. And I do think it affected some of the ways we established some of the M&E KPIs. The framework for reporting framework was very prescriptive. And I think that was more because we didn't trust each other enough, not because we wanted to be prescriptive. And then I think as time evolved, the trust picked up. So the second phase of CocoaAction was much more open, much more designed for people to bring innovation and be able to make claims without having to kind of keep looking over your shoulder. And more cards came out onto the table, as it were, and it became, you know, what it is today, and what has come to become the trust that developed CFI, which would not have happened without CocoaAction, and also the trust that will develop Children First, which will not happen without trust. So I think it's been an amazing journey, honestly.
Thanks, Nico. I wonder if any of the TWC members who maybe joined later on, I'd love to hear your perspective on how did you feel the trust levels were? What was it like to work in that pre-competitive collaboration when you joined?
I guess I can go. Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Frankovich. I look after Cocoa Sustainability for Morris Wrigley. And I came into Cocoa in the Technical Working Committee 3 years ago, so sort of in the middle. And I think my reflections at that time was that, and I had heard some of these stories that Nico shared and from others about those early days. And for me, it was good to see how much had changed in those 3 years. And it was also, we were right in also the thick of sort of our ways of working and what might need to change and how we might adapt. And so I think looking back on it and reflecting, sort of being new to the group, also new to Cocoa, as I look back on it, sort of confronting that reality, I wish we would have done more of that, but I think we were trying, right? I think, as KPMG mentioned, you know, new people come in, new ideas sort of from different approaches. And so it's hard, right? It's an everyday thing. You don't just build ways of working and put it in the drawer or trust. And that is a consistent over time. But like Nico, I think the journey and the reflection is that we can do a lot when we do it together. And so, yeah, I'm very positive and optimistic about the group and expanding, right? We've got to expand. So that's my reflection on sort of coming in at the middle.
Here's Caroline. Hi from Blummer Chocolate. I just wanted to add, I think at the beginning, Nira, you had to push it very deliberately. Like you almost had to drag us along and say, okay, we have a learning agenda. Like what is there that we can share? And slowly it became much more natural. And I think if I look at following the CFI technical calls and stuff like this, I think it has become very natural that whenever someone has something going, it is presented to others, and we are significantly more open towards each other. And as earlier Jerwin was mentioning, for example, this landscape approach, I think 5 years ago everyone would have said, what? Like we are looking at a geographical area in total, and suddenly you put in some resources and actually you don't even know exactly how many your farmers are in there versus someone else's farmers. And yeah, it's been a significant journey. And I think, as I said at the beginning, it was very deliberate, and Nira, you had a hard time in dragging us along. And I think we've come a long way.
It was a joyful exercise each and every day. But I think, that's one of the things, trust is hard to measure. And I think that's sometimes one of the things that if we could figure out a good way to capture that, we'd see a lot of progress. So I think I saw Taco's face pop up. So Taco, please chime in on one of these next questions. We're going to move on. Cedric, this question is for you. The companies have reviewed and discussed the findings of the assessment in detail. And we'd love to hear your overall reaction. What did KPMG get most, did KPMG get most of it right? Or did they miss any key findings? So Cedric, maybe you could jump in, and then Taco, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the assessment on what KPMG got right and anything that they missed.
Thanks. So hi everyone, my name is Cedric Van Kutsem and I work on CocoaAction with Mondelez International. I think when we were first presented the report, it didn't really come as a surprise, honestly. I think we already knew some of this, or at least expected this. But I think it was extremely useful to get everything in one single report that was prepared and validated by an independent party. So well done to KPMG, because it wasn't easy to capture all of this. I think they didn't have that much time to do so. And I think they really did a really good job. Now, I think I really hope that all the stakeholders in the sector will take a very good look at this, at the learnings, because I do believe this can add great value in the ongoing discussions and different platforms where we interact together. And so I really encourage everyone to take a good look at this, and hopefully it will trigger some very interesting discussions on how to do things better together.
Taco, your thoughts?
Yeah, can you hear me well?
We can do. Hello.
Good. Yeah, I've been fighting. I was a bit late, as you noticed. Yeah, maybe something on what I picked up, and maybe the early days is being involved from the start, and this concept of pre-competitive, and there's actually two and then you ask that question, among companies on competitors even. So what is the scope of pre-competitive? I mean, that's one big question that you then need to sort out. So there are clearly elements, I think, that we have figured out where we can work together and where we actually want to work together and have to work together. So that has been one big part of the learning journey. But then actually the fact that you have identified where you can be collaborating on doesn't necessarily mean that you actually know how to do that. And we might know how to do that amongst ourselves eventually, maybe one day, but how do you engage then others in that process is again another big part of the how. And I think, and that's why, I mean, what Cedric mentioned, I think the report captures those very valuable learnings. And if we just assume that in any partnership around sustainability, in any supply chain, collaboration is going to be key. These are very, I would say, essential learnings, not just for the cocoa sector, but for others as well. And I would urge everybody listening and attending, and even we urge ourselves to, let's have a look at this report every 6 months. If we sort of, are we still honest to these learnings of collaboration, and let's forget what we have learned, because it's quite substantial.
Yeah, Taco, I remember you always used to talk about how hard it was to come to the table and then take things back to your own organization. So even the collaboration then you had to take back to your home organization and then bring back to CocoaAction, and the different places and spaces you had to move these issues along. So I think a great advice to keep checking back in and making sure we're tracking on the progress. The next question is for Carolyn. Carolyn, this is around the productivity packages and the community development packages, and what was successful from each of those, and what did you find challenging?
Sorry, I think the success and the challenge are quite closely related in this question. So I would say we all publicly reported into the same M&E framework. We trained enumerators, which was intended to allow for better comparability of reported data. So I think that was a major success, really, despite how prescriptive and tedious, and to some extent it was. I think on the productivity package in particular, I think we got all the necessary components together, which in theory would lead to increased production levels of farms, but we forgot two quite important factors, which is one, the enabling environment, which we particularly saw when, as maybe some of you remember, on the session, the productivity package had planting material, fertilizer, and gap adoption. However, since the 17-18 season, we were no longer allowed to promote planting material or improved hybrids, and neither were we allowed to promote the usage of fertilizer. So suddenly 2 out of 3 of those components, which we in theory had decided, and I think that is valid, which would lead to increased production, were oblivious. Yeah, we weren't able to promote it anymore. So enabling environment we forgot, and we forgot the human behavior, and this is something we realized that actually there is limits to how well do we actually know our target group, the farmer, and do we really understand how he makes economic choices, and why does he not prune, and so on. Then I think another challenge was that both the productivity and the community development package relied heavily on a number of outside factors, as I already said, and these outside factors were never spelled out. In NGO language, this would be assumptions, but we didn't make these assumptions in our M&E framework. And yeah, I think that has. That's what I said on the planting material and on the fertilizer were one of the major learnings, I think, there. Then on community development, I think we were no longer only talking about the importance of improving farmers' livelihoods, but we were actually doing it, and in a fairly comprehensive manner. As Nico said earlier, up to 2012, whatever there were, 2014, it was mainly about XX had been distributed, but really there was very little work done in villages where cocoa was sourced. I think we've gone there through a very steep learning curve in the sense that, yeah, I think we learned that you put $1 here, you spend $1 here, and you cannot expect that this will immediately pay back. And also, obviously, in our logic of having the productivity and the community development pillar next to each other, thinking in theory there would be a lot of overlap between those two pillars that obviously also was only a theory, because really the networks of farmers is unfortunately in most of our supply chains fairly the opposite of dense, unfortunately, so very widespread. So I think in terms of successes, I think the VSLA certainly stands out. I think this is being pushed nowadays by a lot of companies on significantly larger scale, and it is really amazing to see how this develops over multiple cycles, and even really seeing true impact in the moment when you enter a village and you can see that the snowball effect in the tropics has worked, and there is copycats and more groups which built them, which establish themselves without any significant help from outside. That's, I think, when you can really proudly speak about having achieved impact. And it is a great platform to add and tag on numerous other topics, such as nutrition or early childhood development or financial literacy, and so on. On the child labor side, maybe, and then I'm sorry for taking up so much time. I leave it to my colleagues maybe to add. On the child labor side, I would say we gained traction, maybe not as quickly as expected, on putting in place child labor monitoring and remediation systems. But it was slow, and I think it only really moved when all of us, I think, accept the fact that it needed a specific budget for it, and I think that's the first part is putting in place the monitoring of it and having households profiled. But then this challenge is now reducing the time lag between cases identified and remediation. So I think there's a lot of things we can learn for Children First initiative and so on. So that's it from my side.
Thank you, Kim. And I think there's a lot of depth, right? There's a lot of details of those packages. And so good to kind of hear some of what worked and what was more challenging. This next question is for both Kim and then Olivier. We're wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what you feel are some of the most important takeaways from the assessment. What will you carry with you as you go forward, as you continue in cocoa sustainability? Kim, over to you first.
Sure, I think I'll just highlight two. I think for me, one of the important takeaways is that we actually can work together. We can do it. I think it was questioned, obviously, and I think sometimes we still can question it every day. But we absolutely can work together towards common goals. But we also, it's an we need to engage and also co-create with those that aren't necessarily in the room and those critical stakeholders that help create an enabling environment, right? And can bring in expertise, right, that may not be in the room as well. I think the second thing I would highlight is we can also share. We can share a lot. However, we also must streamline and also use the info and data that we share to adapt, right? We've talked about the need to use data in a way that informs, but also sort of creates that agility and adaptation that needs to happen so that we can scale more efficiently, quickly, and impactfully. And I think for both of those items, I'd also highlight trust. And I think I mentioned this before, which is that building that trust requires us to confront reality and hold each other accountable. And you can do that in a variety of ways. And I think going forward, I like the tacos provocation that every 6 months, let's go back, but also how can we individually as companies or even as people, right? How do we step change? Because at the end of the day, we want to drive that improvement on the ground. We're not there to just get around a table and talk about things and look at the objectives, the intent, and that's what I feel with the group. And maybe the assessment doesn't bring that out, which is everybody around the table is focused on that, which is improving more quickly and leveraging each other's expertise, but also how and where we invest.
Thanks, Kim. Olivier, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, of course, much has been already said, so I'll not try to also highlight some other things. I think one of the big learnings and takeaways from CocoaAction has been, I mean, this was 9 companies that were that committed to CocoaAction and put it in practice. And I think one of the key learnings indeed that we need to have a much broader, like, shared ownership. So not just the leading companies, but to get, how can we get everybody on board, not within industry, and not just the big companies, but especially the small and medium-sized companies. How do we can get them on board? How can we provide them incentives and tools to take action as well? Because, you know, for those companies, they might be further away from their supply chain than we are as larger companies. So we need to see together with them how they can get involved. Of course, they need to feel ownership, but we need to also incentivize them. The engagement with the government is key, which of course in CocoaAction is something which wasn't the case. It was more an industry initiative than a joint initiative. And this is something that you need to do from the start. You cannot go do this halfway. You need to get them on board from the very start to make sure that together you address the issues in the cocoa supply chain. I mean, one of the things mentioned as well is that we should not just do this as a cocoa initiative, but looking with other sectors, how can we collaborate, and who can we use as a broker to bring those different sectors together and work on it in a collective way. This is not for say the chocolate industry to, I think, to get other sectors on board. I think we need to also look at other stakeholders that can play that role. So that will be, I think, really essential. And in the end, also the coordination on the ground. So what are we going to do where? And this is indeed where data will be very relevant, and making data work. So those are definitely some of the key takeaways from CocoaAction. And I mean, one thing is to get it straight from get it right from the start. But also one important learning from CocoaAction is course correction. So if during the journey new insights come into play, like for example the issue of deforestation that came into play during those years, we never say expanded the scope of CocoaAction, and I think this is an important learning. So if there are new insights, we need to implement them, build on it, so that we are be open for course correction and not be too stubborn in, say, the direction that from the start. It's a fluid process.
Thanks, Olivier. We've got about probably 8 or 9 minutes to jump in some questions from the audience. And one of the first questions that we have touches on something that Olivier just mentioned, which is how can governments be more involved, and how can they have more impact in the design phase? Anyone want to pick up on that question?
Well, I mean, if you look at CFI, that's a good example. CFI was developed in the form of a framework for action, which was created with what you might call an independent convener who sat in the middle of the table between us, industry, and represented by industry members, but predominantly by World Cocoa Foundation. And then on the other side of the table was the governments of Ivory Coast and Ghana. And we agreed over time actions under a framework for action that the government needed to commit to, and what industry needed to commit to, and that we would report on it publicly on an annual basis, and that we would work together. That is, I think, the approach that we're looking for with Children First, and I think it's going to happen. And I think any future discussions around prospering farmers, as I would call it, which should be in that direction, where we're working together with the government, creating an enabling environment, and us committing to do the actions that we are responsible to commit to, and then being measured for doing those actions on both sides, not just industry, but the government as well.
Can I add something to that, Nira?
Yeah, of course, please go.
Yeah, I think we now know that, I mean, you asked the how, but it's even more crucial that if we do not include the right stakeholders, we shouldn't even start. And I think that is a very essential insight, that one thing we had hoped to engage others more in the process, but one of the conclusions of the report, we weren't necessarily designed to do that. So I think in that design phase, both in content and both on engagement, you need to have a right, I would say, representation from the right stakeholders. I mean, not everybody, but your design needs to be, I would say, potential for including others, and that I think is something we missed a bit.
Thanks.
And if I can add to it, I think what you're seeing right now is that, I mean, in the consumer countries, you see especially also on the side of governments, that they feel the pressure that they need to take responsibility. So in Europe, you see all these national initiatives popping up. And I mean, this is very good that there is really a call for action there. But at the same time, what you want to avoid is all those different initiatives that are coexisting next to each other. While at the same time, we're all targeting the same, which is mainly Ivory Coast and Ghana. And we need to ensure that all those very well-intentioned initiatives are harmonized in a way that we can actually deliver on them, and not create a very bureaucratic situation where we have to do reporting to different initiatives with different, indicators, different stakeholders. And so I think this is also very important now, is that we are streamlining these developments, which are happening at national level, at EU level, different continents, that we are doing this really in a collective way.
Thanks, Olivier. The next set of questions is around impact, and we've had sort of two different questions that are around the same thing. So Nico, at the beginning you mentioned, back in 2013, people were very focused on promoting their CSR activities. And the question is around, has that really changed? And much of the public reporting that companies do is still focused on activities or reporting actions. And so wondering if there are examples of well-designed impact assessments that you've seen, and also connected to Jeroen's presentation, what were the real impacts and outcomes on the ground of CocoaAction?
Who are you asking the question? Because I heard my name and you asked to Nico, sorry.
Let's start with Nico. Let's hear from
Okay,
Nico.
yeah.
I think it's just generally asking around the impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is that the companies, particularly a lot of the CocoaAction companies, have made time-bound impact-related commitments, which relate to things like poverty or living income, or eradication of child labor, or deforestation. As an example, we've made a Forever Chocolate commitment in 2016, which is time-bound and measurable, and it's not based on actions, it's based on outcome, it's based on impact. So poverty, child labor, and deforestation. We've worked very closely with organizations like AgriLogic, Wageningen University, and KIT. One of the biggest challenges with measuring impact is the time it takes for impact to happen. If you're replanting a farm or renovating a farm, it can be 5 years before you see real impact. If you're applying fertilizer, it can be 2 years. If you're, actions that you're taking in communities may not move the needle for a year or 2 years or whatever. So what we're trying to do is fine tune the principles of how do you take measurements of adoption implying impact, and then reviewing and making sure it did. So you're indicating you're going in the right direction, and then you're claiming that that direction happened. So, for example, a farm business plan or a farm development plan, if a farmer has implemented that for 2, maybe 3 years in a row, you then can start to claim impact. And you start seeing change in behavior and change of activity on the farm. But it's a complex and difficult challenge, but we are all now being measured by impact. Nobody's interested in how many farmers you trained. They want to know how many farmers are either out of poverty or getting a living income.
If I can build on that, and I agree with Nico, and I think also maybe the beauty of CocoaAction, we now built quite a track record of data that we can now use to better understand the impact. I think now different companies also started to have individual approaches looking into this, and there's much more room and opportunities to share these learnings. So I'm confident this is going to happen now.
Neera, I'd have one build, which is also around the baseline. You have to have something to measure against. And I think one of my reflections, and I think Nico has mentioned this in the early days, right? If we didn't have the data from the beginning, it's hard to measure what that change was. And so critical is the baselines, but also being able that the study actually has to be adapted as well, right? These aren't static farmers, these aren't static communities. People come in and out, and different things change that may or may not relate to your actual investment. So I think people talk about impact as being something easy to do, and it's not, because these are living, changing every day.
Thanks, everyone. We unfortunately have a lot more questions than we have time to answer today. So if your question didn't get answered, please post it in the chat for the general partnership meeting. I believe that's on Pathable. And for our close, we're going to turn to Rick Scobie, WCF president, for some closing remarks.
You know, I think the past hour has highlighted the strength and uniqueness of CocoaAction. You've seen 9 companies working together with a level of trust and reflection and building on each other's observations to generate more impact than I've seen in any other sector. When I joined WCF as the president 4.5 years ago, CocoaAction was mid-course in implementation. And I truly had never seen any similar collective action endeavor in any sector. I'd come from 30 years at the World Bank and was utterly blown away by the level of collaboration and commitment to joint action and joint learning. We commissioned the KPMG assessment to take away the key learnings for the future collective action that the cocoa industry is developing. And I think you've heard from all of the speakers what the main messages are, and I just want to reinforce several of them. We've taken our flagship collaboration, CocoaAction, and have built on it to develop similar public-private collective action initiatives in deforestation, and several speakers spoke about the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. And we're in the final stages of building a similar public-private partnership with the involvement of UNICEF and ILO on child labor, which we call the Children First Partnership that you've heard about. One very important lesson that we've learned from CocoaAction that we've integrated into CFI and Children First is the importance of the integrated and holistic solution. As KPMG emphasized, there were elements of CocoaAction that were more technical focused and didn't step back and address the whole picture. In the case of Cocoa and Forest Initiative, we have 3 strategic building blocks of forest protection and restoration, sustainable livelihoods and sustainable production, and 3rd, community empowerment and social inclusion. Similarly, in the case of Children First, we have 4 integrated pillars of education, of child protection systems, of poverty reduction, and of child survival, particularly health, water, and nutrition. A second important lesson learned that we're integrating into our new partnerships is the increased role and engagement with government. And that's why we've built CFI and Children First as public-private partnerships with frameworks of action that spell out clearly and with accountability what industry is going to do over time, and what government's going to do over time. Third important takeaway is the need for more engagement with other stakeholders and actors in the supply chain, particularly civil society organizations, research institutes, and donors. We really have the sense we need to have more transparency and accountability of what we're doing, and so that's a valuable role for the civil society groups. And we need complementary financing and support on the policy dialogue from donors, and we need additional technical knowledge from research institutes. So we've integrated much more multi-stakeholder collaboration into the child labor and Cocoa and Forest initiative. The fourth important takeaway that's been discussed several times is the importance of building a bigger tent of companies. It is remarkable that the 9 of the leading cocoa and chocolate companies came together in CocoaAction. And what we've learned is we want to have an even bigger footprint in the supply chain. So in the case of the Cocoa and Forest initiative, we now have 36 companies who've signed up and are making commitments. A fifth important lesson that we're scaling up is much greater focus on policy dialogue and addressing the enabling policy environment. And as you've heard, we're partly doing that in greater engagement with consuming governments like the European Union and the US government to talk about putting in place global regulations that put in place a level playing field for all actors. We're also doing that at the regional level in the development and participation of the Africa Regional Cocoa Sustainability Standard. But most importantly, we're doing it at the national level. And we're spending a lot of time talking to the governments about what policies need to be in place to ensure sustainability. So we're looking at land use, we're looking at natural resource management, we're looking at pricing policies, all of the different policy levers at the national level. Sixth important takeaway that you've heard is we need to incorporate simpler monitoring and evaluation frameworks that really draw on core evidence and data about impact and also builds on real baselines. It was one of the most powerful takeaways of CocoaAction is that we had over-designed the M&E framework and it wasn't delivering the results that we actually needed for decision making. Then the final observation is what Kim had mentioned. It's about the importance of putting in place streamlined and dynamic decision making that will allow for mid-course corrections. And as we've moved to CFI and to Children First, we're spending a lot of time talking about what's an effective company governance and engagement model to have decision-making focus on delivering outputs and impacts and not just focusing on process. I don't want to make it sound like the industry has it figured out, because one of our most important takeaways from CocoaAction is that we're not going to get it right at the design stage, and we're going to have to constantly be adaptive and mid-course correct. And I think that's probably what we're bringing most into CFI and Children First, a sense of the trust and optimism that we learned in CocoaAction and real pragmatic learnings about how to mid-course correct. So with that, Neera, I turn it back to you to close us out.
Thank you, Rick, for your reflections, and thanks to all of our speakers for joining us today. We're so grateful for the time you've taken out to reflect with us and to share all of the lessons learned. A huge thank you also to KPMG for the many weeks and nights we know that they spent digging through all the data and coming up with the assessment. Thanks, everyone.